So one of my greatest joys as a pastor is connecting with people. And for those of you online, I want to welcome you today. I put an email out there, email address, pastortonline at riverwood.cc a couple of weeks ago, and just invited you, wherever you are, in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, across Canada, around the world, wherever you are, just to kind of reach out and say hi. And I've received a number of emails, and I got to tell you, it's so great connecting with you. So if this is your church, if you are online church, if you're part of our online church worship community, fire me off just a wave or a hello or introduce yourself. I'd love to get to know you better. And of course, that goes for everybody here at the factory as well. It's so good to be together today. So you know how the United States has its 9/11, its big tragic moment. Well, Japan has its 3/11. It was at 2:46 in the afternoon on March the 11th of 2011 that an earthquake happened about 74 kilometers off of the coast. And it was very deep. It happened at about 24 kilometers deep into the ocean. This was the fourth largest earthquake recorded in world history. And yet the people of Japan didn't really know what was going on. They didn't really feel it in such a big way because it was so far below the surface. However, it was a seismic shift. Everything shifted. In fact, the main island moved 2.5 meters to the east. The whole island of Japan moved to the east. The earthquake shifted the Earth's axis a little bit. It even increased the rotation of the Earth. Everything had changed, and yet, for the people in Japan, they kind of went about their normal business. I mean, the factories continued to buzz. The taxi drivers and couriers continued to jockey for position in the traffic. The kids were looking forward to the end of school day and complaining about homework. The markets were full of people going grocery shopping. And when the first tsunami warning was issued, it was based on faulty information. So they thought it was just going to be a 3-meter tsunami. About 25 minutes later, they said, no, we now think it's going to be a 6-meter tsunami. This is serious stuff. And 19 minutes after that, they revised it again to say, we think this could be a 10-meter or more tsunami. When it actually hit, it turned out that in some places it was 40 meters high, 133 feet high in places, traveling at 700 kilometers an hour. It went up to 10 kilometers inland. 20,000 people were killed by the tsunami. 120,000 buildings were destroyed. 726,000 buildings were damaged, and it was deemed the costliest natural disaster in history. After the waters had receded, and after the bodies had been counted, they did some surveys, and they found out that there were about 40% of the people didn't really take this thing seriously. In fact, they didn't take it serious enough to get to higher ground, and 10% didn't even think a tsunami was coming. They were kind of denial. They were like, there's not going to be a tsunami. Church, a little bit of geography here and geology. To understand this, tsunamis are produced when there's a seismic shift deep under the ground, and then the oceans begin to surge, and it produces this wave of destruction. And it's my guess that many of you today have felt the seismic shift in culture. I'm guessing that you've kind of felt some things changing and some stuff that's different than it used to be. And you might even have a sense that there is kind of like, it feels like there's a wave coming our direction, but I don't know what words to use to describe it, and I don't know if it's even real, and is it going to happen or is it not going to happen? Well, I can't be absolutely certain whether the tsunami of culture that's coming our way is going to be a 3-meter, 6-meter, or 10-meter, or 40-meter tsunami. I don't know. But I do sense that there is a shift going on in culture, and for the next number of weeks, that's what we want to study. Let me sort of show you, just give you a little bit of perspective of some of the shifts. So I was imagining the other day, if I had fallen into a coma when I was a young adult, and I had just recently woken up, what would I be waking up to? Well, when I fell asleep, it was only convicts and sailors that got tattoos, and now my mild-mannered daughters all have tattoos, so there's one change. When I fell asleep, we had 3 channels on the TV, and one of them was French. I didn't understand it. When I woke up, there would be 800 channels. 600 new series every year, standalone series, and a little box inside or beside our TVs that have about 25,000 movies on them. When I fell asleep, it was illegal to marry somebody of the same gender, illegal to buy marijuana, and illegal to die in any way other than natural. And when I woke up, it would have been legal to marry somebody of the same gender, marijuana sales, medically assisted death, all of that would have been legal. And not only legal, but I would have woken up to a world where that's all normal. When I fell asleep, there were 3 magazines that would have been tempting people towards pornography. I would have woken up to 1.3 million websites accessible 24/7 on our little devices that we carry with us all the time. When I fell asleep, it would have been normal for me to call customer service and have a conversation with a human. When I woke up, it would have been normal to have a conversation with a chatbot of some sort that recognized my voice and could identify me by my voice print and answer my questions. When I fell asleep, kids played outside. The only shots that were taken at schools were in the basketball nets, and you kept your shoes on at the airport. You knew 5 or 6 friends by name, and you knew their faces, and you didn't take pictures of your food, you just ate it. Well, all that's changed. When I fell asleep 20, 25 years ago, I would have fallen asleep to hope and anticipation of a new millennium. And I would have woken up in shock to a global pandemic having killed millions, a supply chain crisis, rampant inflation, less factual certainty about anything, and more disagreement and doubt about everything, even though we are so much more scientifically enlightened. I would have awoken to a world where democracies are declining in the world. There are real live nuclear missile threats, talk of an extinction event because of the climate catastrophe, and a world where we're wondering if we maybe have just let the genie out of the bottle when it comes to machine learning, artificial intelligence, poised to not only eliminate jobs, but to now make decisions of who lives and who dies on the battlefield, and literally threatening to take over humanity in the next 50 years. And when it comes to our faith and our church, I would have fallen asleep when the church was enjoying over 1,000 years of being in the culture, and being in a culture where just about everybody, even if they didn't attend church, they knew that it was a good thing, that there was benefits to being part of a church, even if they didn't necessarily go. I would have woken up to this 1,000 years of influence that we had had as a church, shaping laws, literally shaping countries, inventing things like education and science, and shaping governments and morality and society. But 25 years later, I would have woken up to a world where that is no longer the case. For over 1,000 years, the church has pointed out problems and tried to solve problems, but now many people in our culture believe that the church is the problem. Or as somebody has said, the world doesn't have a problem with Jesus. They're not afraid of Jesus, but they are afraid of us. And this has left many of us living in the sense that we're somewhere between a cultural earthquake way below the surface that we haven't seen and we think we feel, and the possibility of a coming tsunami. We can feel the shift. We can see something on the horizon that we think is heading our way, but we don't necessarily have the words to describe it. So how do you live in a rapidly changing culture that is even seeming like it's turning on you and turning on your faith? How do you react? Well, that's going to be the topic and the theme of our study for the next 4 weeks. But let me begin with a moment in history not that much different than what we're facing today. Paul and Silas had walked into the metropolis of Athens in about 50 AD. And as they walked into Athens, they discovered that the culture was very much against them. The Athenians, in fact, were demonstrating. We read this in Acts chapter 17. The Athenians were demonstrating against Paul and Silas. This is what it says. Paul and Silas have caused trouble all over the world, they said. And now they're here disturbing our city too. They are all guilty of treason. for they profess allegiance to another king named Jesus. The people of the city, as well as the city council, were thrown into turmoil by these reports. The people of the city and the city council were offended, they were disturbed, they were in turmoil because of what the Christians believed. Meanwhile, we read that Paul himself walked into Athens and his spirit was disturbed. It was provoked. He felt like there was some things happening that just weren't necessarily right. The scene is a powder keg of tension and polarized ideas. The earth beneath Paul's feet was shaking. There was this tsunami of opposition that was coming towards him. So what does Paul do? What does Paul do in this moment? Well, it's actually a fantastic lesson in cultural earthquake survival. Verse 16. Now, while Paul was in Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. Paul wasn't running away from the cultural tensions. Paul wasn't denying them or pretending that they weren't real and weren't there. He wasn't afraid of the cultural tension. He wasn't intimidated by the cultural opposition. He didn't give in and just become like everybody else in Athens. Paul was observing, and he was studying, and he was spectating what was going on. He went to school on the culture, and he went to school on the idols that the Athenians were worshiping. In other words, Paul wanted to dive down below the surface and observe the tectonic plates that were shifting and changing in culture. Dr. Jim Dennison is a cultural theologian and professor of philosophy and theology, and he has named 4 cultural earthquakes, 4 cultural tectonic plates that are way below the surface and many of us maybe aren't even quite aware of, that have shifted in the last number of years, causing some form of tsunami to be coming towards the shores of our faith. In other words, he's observing culture and he's studying culture much in the same way that Paul did. Now, little disclaimer note here for a minute. Today, we're going to do a lot more looking at history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and psychology than necessarily theology of the Bible. I'm not abandoning the Bible, but what we want to do is actually do what Paul did, which is to observe and spectate and study the culture and get some context so that over the next 3 weeks, we can talk more about a biblical way to approach and handle culture. We're simply attempting to do what Paul did by studying culture. So, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a little like drinking from a fire hose, okay? Here we go. Cultural theologian Dr. Dennison says that the first tectonic plate we need to recognize as shifting is the rise of the post-truth culture. And the first tremors of this post-truth culture, you would think that they are just happening in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but it actually turns out that these tremors were happening way back as early as the mid-1800s with a Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard. And Søren Kierkegaard was the father of existentialism. All right, I know it's early on a Sunday morning to be talking about existentialism, but stick with me here and you'll see how his ideas from the mid-1800s have actually shaped much of our thinking. Existentialism is defined as a philosophical approach which emphasizes the individual person as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of the will. This was the very beginning of what we today know as live your truth. Be your authentic self. Believe in yourself. Be true to your authentic self. Now, these make for very heartwarming and wonderful phrases on mugs and t-shirts, but as a Christ follower, you hear these phrases and there's something in your spirit that is provoked. There's something in your spirit that doesn't quite feel right. You see, 200 years ago, it was normal for people to look up and to look out to discover truth. The change and the shift has nearly completely happened where now, where we discover truth is by looking inside. And it started 200 years ago with Kierkegaard. In this postmodern, post-truth era in which we now live, objective truth is a ludicrous idea. And it's being replaced with such things as relativism, pluralism, individualism, and subjectivity. But this is a serious problem for us Christians. We have a bit of an opposition with this idea of living in a post-truth culture. And the reason it's a serious problem is, number one, because it flies directly in the face of God's word. The world says there is no truth. There is no such thing as absolute truth. There is no truth out there. You find the truth inside. Live your authentic self. Be your authentic self. And yet the scriptures say something totally different. Let me show you real quick. 2 Timothy 2:15. Do everything you can to present yourself to God as one who is fully genuine, a worker unashamed of your mission, a guide capable of leading others along a correct path defined by the word of truth. The Bible tells us that there is truth and you can know it, and there's a pathway of truth. John 1:14, the word became flesh, that's Jesus, and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John 1:17, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Truth is found in Jesus Christ. John 14:6, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth. I am the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And John 17:17, this is what Jesus prayed, make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. The scriptures make it so incredibly clear. And the first reason that Christ followers can't accept this notion that truth is found inside of ourselves is that we believe the Word of God, and we believe that the Word of God tells us that truth is found outside of ourselves and actually in the Word of God. The second reason is that relativism is highly problematic. This whole idea of relativism, we won't dive deep into this, but this being your authentic self and living your truth would seem to suggest that the interior of a human being and the interior of a human heart is coherent, and it is singular and is fixed. But the fact is that our hearts are not coherent and singular and fixed. Back in the mid-1700s, theologian John Wesley said this of the interior of humans. Listen to this. He said, they are a motley mix of all sorts of contrarieties. Your heart is a motley mix of all sorts of contrarieties. So inside my human heart, there is love. There is joy. There is patience, there is peace, there's forgiveness, there's understanding, and all sorts of good things. But also inside of my human heart and yours, there's greed, and there's selfishness, and there is fear. There is distrust and apathy and judgmentalism. In many human hearts is manipulation and violence and pride and lust and a need for revenge. So which authentic self am I supposed to be true to? Live your authentic self. Which one? Which authentic self? Because it's all in there. The fact is that much of what is labeled living our authentic self and being true to ourselves is simply a euphemism for selfishness, for arrogance, for narcissism, or for what we Christians call sin. The third reason our spirit is provoked with this notion that truth is found inside of ourselves is, number three, the whole world is marching to the same unseen drummer. Philosopher René Girard observed the ironic conformity that comes to people who are seeking nonconformity. So they say, I'm going to be different. I'm going to go my own path. I'm going to be my own person. I'm going to be unique to my calling and to who I am. And he says this, the effort to leave the beaten path forces everyone inevitably into the same ditch. So everybody wants to be unique and live their own truth, and they all end up in the same ditch. What the world thinks is radical self-expression and living my authentic truth is nothing more than bowing with everyone else at the altar of the same algorithm. shackled to the same cultural forces, but thinking that they've been set free and enlightened by some sort of new freedom. And quite simply, Christ followers don't buy it. Christ followers say, actually, self is probably the problem. That's what the Word of God says. And that's why Jesus calls us to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Him with our whole heart. But it's this seismic shift in the tectonic plates called post-truth culture deep below the surface that is forming a wave, and the wave is roaring towards us, and it's accusing us of being irrelevant at best. As a Christian, you have become irrelevant at best and more likely repressive, out of touch, out of step, and outdated. And if that was the only tectonic shift and the only tectonic plate of culture that we had to deal with, that would be difficult enough. But Dr. Dennison actually points out that there are 4 cultural earthquakes and plates shifting at the very same time at this moment in history. And here's the second one, the sexual revolution. Now, many of us would think that, well, hold it, the sexual revolution that started in the 60s maybe ended sometime in the early to mid-70s, and that's sort of a thing of the past. And yet the fact is that much of what happened in the cultural or the sexual revolution started earlier, much, much earlier than the 60s, and is continuing on today. Now, we don't have time to go through a real in-depth study of this, but a very simple hopscotching through history shows us that the influences of the sexual revolution started a couple of hundred years ago. In fact, let me sort of just hopscotch you through this real quick. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that the human nature was inherently good, and that we discover freedom and goodness when the social restraints are removed. That happened back in the 1700s, began laying the groundwork for let's get rid of the social constraints and we'll all be set free. The English naturalist Charles Darwin taught that humans are simply well-developed animals, material objects of chance with no divine origins or purpose or responsibility. Again, this happened 150 years ago and began to lay the foundation for what we see in the 60s. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche taught that God is dead and humanity needs to be set free from the constraints of morality as handed down from an imaginary God. You can begin to see where this is all heading. It's taking time, but it's heading towards something. The Australian psychologist Sigmund Freud taught that at the core of our being, we are sexual, and we flourish when we are set free sexually. And the Australian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich taught that sexual orgasms could hold the key to healing the body. Talk about sexual healing. And coined the term sexual revolution. These are just a few of the people that laid the foundation for, and some of the players that laid the foundation for the sexual revolution. And this is fascinating. It's a fascinating study, and it's complicated. It's a complicated study, but it began to catch momentum in the 60s, and it continues to evolve today. We don't have time to talk about all the dynamics. It is very multi-layered. The massive shift through the women's, the modern feminism movement, the influence of the pill and birth control, the court cases that the porn industry won to get rid of the terminology obscene material and the freedom for everybody to own it, the cultural wave that swept America with young people protesting against the Vietnam War, and their protest chant, of course, was, "We're going to make love, not war," and make love they did. There was an explosion in rock and roll and public nudity and drugs and complete freedom of sex. And then, inspired by the civil rights movement, the Stonewall riots of 1969 galvanized the LGBTQ community to lobbying for LGBTQ rights that started in the early 70s, finally winning the right to same-sex marriage in the first state in the United States in 2004. So much shifted in those first 40 years of the sexual revolution. It was absolutely remarkable how much shifted in terms of sexual ethics, morality, and freedom and expression. But it's only just beginning. By 2000, we thought the sexual revolution was over, but in the last 23 years, we've discovered, wow, there is so much more going on in the sexual revolution. A redefining of gender, recognizing now up to or more than 100 different gender identities and distinctions. Corporations realizing that there is money in not only promoting their product or their service, but there is money in jumping on board to promote the revolutionary social, sexual, and gender changes. And so now it's become monetized and it's become big corporation. And stay tuned, because as we look ahead, the sexual revolution is not over. There are things on the horizon that are going to possibly shock you. One of the things that's being developed right now is AI and virtual reality and sex with machines. That's about to be developed and rolled out in the next number of years. In the future, there's going to be a continued sort of decline in marriages as it's replaced by the normalization of polyamorous relationships, which is relationships with multiple spouses or partners. And there's an old theme that we're not going to get into today, but actually was very dominant 100 years ago, and we're beginning to see it come back, and I believe we're going to see it even more in the future, is the sexualization of children. Now, many of us, just at the mention of that, would say, that could never happen. That could never happen in our lifetime. And yet, you need to realize that when you're living in a relativistic world, where the truth is defined by individual imagination and desire, and this world has a need to explore and push the boundaries as a continued expression of freedom from the oppressive moral constraints, and your self-identity becomes God, anything is possible. Now, in a great irony, if you choose to live your truth, if you choose to be true to yourself, and you say, you know what, I'm going to live my truth, which is to follow God and His Word, believing that God created us and He probably knows a thing or two about our sexuality. If you choose to live your truth, don't expect to be celebrated for being your authentic self. In fact, today you're going to end up being labeled intolerant. And you'll probably be called hateful and bigoted and a hindrance to the progress of society. So now you got a real problem, because now you're having to deal with a label on you from culture that says you're irrelevant, backwards, and out of touch, but now you're also intolerant simply because you have a different opinion on sexual ethics. But Dr. Dennison goes on to take us on a deep-sea dive to examine a third tectonic plate under the surface called critical theory. Now, unfortunately, the study of critical theory and critical race theory is above my pay grade. I don't understand most of it. So I'm going to keep this super simple and dumbed down just so that I can understand it, okay? The phrase critical theory was first used in 1937 in a paper written by a German Marxist philosopher named Max Horkheimer. And it's postulated that most of us just simply want to observe and understand culture, but he said, no, critical theory tries to reveal, critique, and challenge the power structures in order to liberate those who are enslaved in that society. Now, in both critical theory and critical race theory, you look at how the structure of society is ordered and who has gained power and who has used their power to prosper. And usually, those people are called the oppressors. And if there's an evil in the culture, it's brought back to the oppressor's fault. Now, that's kind of a kindergarten explanation of critical theory. But there's a shaking going on in North America under the surface these days that is creating all sorts of waves. And I know that there's all sorts of different opinions on this, and I'm not trying to stir up any sorts of different opinions, but here's kind of how this goes. It was Christians who imported and bought and abused slaves to the United States as they established their colonial outpost. It was Christians who negotiated unfair treaties with North America's indigenous peoples. It was Christians and churches who colonized continents and confined First Nations peoples to reserves. It was Christian churches that removed indigenous children from their homes and stripped them of their culture in residential schools. It was Christian priests who sexually and physically abused children right up until this decade. And as if we hadn't learned as a faith, it was Christian televangelists and megachurch pastors who used their power and popularity to sexually victimize women and men. And all of this sin and all of this abuse and misuse of power and mistreatment and injustice has created a 9.1 magnitude quake. And we live in a culture today where Christians are deemed the oppressors. You may be the most caring, compassionate, justice-minded person who abhors racism and humbly tries to do better than our forefathers, confessing and owning the injustices of the past. But don't be surprised if you still are looked at as an oppressor because you're a Christian. Now, the fact is that critical theory is deeply debated, it's deeply complex, it's multi-layered, it's a source of all sorts of debates and arguments and much anger. But regardless of where you land on the issue that is stirring outside in culture, there's no denying that Christians and Christian institutions have misused their power and have caused much pain, especially for the vulnerable. And we need to own that. Now, that's three waves that we encounter. You are irrelevant, you're intolerant, and you're an oppressor. But Dr. Dennison names one final tectonic plate that's shifting, the rise of secular religion. If you take a look at the etymology of the word religion, you find that it literally means obligation. It means reverence, giving honor to something. It means life under a vow or to bind. The world's traditional religions of Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism have all sort of been portrayed or understood by our culture as being irrational, illogical, deeply restrictive, delusional, based on fairy tales, regressive, and even harmful. So these major religions are right now being replaced by a far more rational, far more welcoming, far more freeing, far more evidence and science-based, friendly, progressive, far more reasonable, liberating religion called secularism. And any other religion that challenges the claims of this religion, secularism, are deemed dangerous. So Paul walks into Athens, and the entire culture is against him. He is deemed as somebody who is in opposition. In fact, listen to Acts 17:18. It says this. It says, some asked, "What is this babbling fool trying to say?" Others said, "He seems to be speaking about a foreign god." Like they didn't have a clue what he was talking about because what he was talking about was so against what was accepted in the culture. The Athenians had gods that they were accustomed to and everybody worshipped, and Paul's God was threatening their gods. So you can well imagine that he is now being labeled irrelevant to the Athenian culture. He's being labeled intolerant, possibly oppressive and dangerous, certainly dangerous. And Paul is having his own experience in this moment of walking into this culture. He feels provoked and unsettled in his spirit. He can feel the ground shaking beneath his feet. He can sense this tsunami of opposition speeding towards him. So what does he do? How does he handle this? Well, he wasn't provoked to fear. He was provoked in his spirit, but we don't read that he was provoked to fear or to running away or hiding. He wasn't provoked to attacking and trying to topple the ideology straight on. He wasn't provoked to protesting and rallying a bunch of people to a demonstration in opposition of the cultural shift. Now listen, I'm not saying that protesting or demonstrating is wrong. I'm not saying that being involved in lawsuits is wrong. I'm not saying that practicing your rights and standing up against these things are wrong. It's just as we studied this passage in this moment, that was not his response. He wasn't provoked to combat, starting a culture war. But look at what he did. We read this in verse 17. He discussed it with the Jews and the other like-minded people at their meeting place. And every day he went out to the marketplace and talked with anybody who happened along. He got to know. He got to know some of the Epicurean and Stoic intellectuals pretty well through these conversations. Number one, Paul observed and studied the shifting culture. He didn't bury his head in the sand. He wanted to know what was going on. Number two, Paul talked about it and began to talk out. And he was in the marketplace and he would talk with different people about these things. Number three, Paul didn't seem to take offense to being labeled. We don't see anywhere there where he was all offended by the opposition he was experiencing. Number four, Paul built relationships with those who opposed him. He didn't start a culture war. He didn't try to force change or gain the upper hand of control. He respectfully engaged in conversation. And number five actually kind of blows me away. Paul found ways to compliment those who opposed him. This is fascinating. The Council of Athens invites Paul in to explain himself, and this is what we read. So Paul took his stand in the open space and laid it out for them. And this is what he said. Athenians, it is plain to see that you Athenians take your religion seriously. In fact, when I arrived here at the city the other day, I was fascinated with all the shrines I came across. And then I found one inscribed to the God nobody knows. I'm here to introduce you to this God so that you can worship intelligibly, knowing who you are dealing with. This is remarkable. Paul's spirit was provoked and irritated with the idols he saw in the culture, and he could feel the tension in the air as his beliefs were contradicting and being dangerous to the dominant beliefs of the culture. Yet he started by finding something to compliment them on. And if I was to give one word to Paul's approach, it would be this word: compassion. Paul had compassion. There's a French philosopher, Etienne Gilson, who said this. He said, there still remains only God to protect man against man. Either we will serve him in spirit and truth, or we shall enslave ourselves ceaselessly, more and more, to the monstrous idol that we have made with our own hands, to our own image and likeness. Paul had compassion for the Athenians, seeing that they had enslaved themselves to a monstrous idol of their own making. So, church, as we navigate the coastal village of faith that is beginning to experience tsunamis of opposition, labeling us irrelevant and intolerant and oppressive and dangerous, my prayer is that we would remain, or maybe become, compassionate towards those who oppose us. You see, those who bow to the monstrous idol of secularism, they are not our enemies. Those who abandon God's truth for the world's definition of truth, they are not our enemies. Those who have been swept away by the powerful and impassioned lure of the old sexual revolution and the new sexual revolution, they are not our enemies. Those who rightly point out our repressive history as a faith, they are not our enemies. Facing intense opposition and resistance and persecution, I want to read to you what Paul said. Listen to this. Paul knew who the enemy was. He said, the God who rules this world, that's not our Yahweh God, that's a different God, that's Satan. The God who rules this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers. They cannot see the light, which is the good news about our glorious Christ, who shows what God is like. Paul knew who the enemy was. Paul also knew that his faith was going to cost him. But more than anything, Paul knew the hope that is in Jesus Christ and that stands in front of us. You know, today as we launch this series, Culture Shock, even as we've talked about these various different tectonic plates that are shifting in culture, I can well imagine that across this room and for those of you online, that there's all sorts of emotions going on. For some of you, there's anger. For some of you, there's anger at something that happens in the world that's happening in your workplace, or it might even be anger with me for saying something today. For some of us, there's confusion. What does that mean? For some of us, there's fear. Oh my goodness, there's a tsunami, and what am I supposed to do with this? Is my faith strong enough? For some of us, there's doubt. For some of us, there's curiosity. For some of us, there's this sense I need to go to war with culture. And I want to just focus all of your emotions, if I can, on the further words of what Paul said. And I'm going to leave you with these today, and then we'll continue our study next weekend. This is what he said. We often suffer, but we're never crushed. Even when we don't know what to do, we never give up. In times of trouble, God is with us. And when we are knocked down, we get up again. What's going on in our world, these are little troubles. These little troubles, and he was being persecuted at the time, these little troubles are getting us ready for an eternal glory that will make all of our troubles seem like nothing. Things that are seen, things that are going on in culture right now, they're not going to last forever. But things that are not seen are eternal. This is why we keep our minds on the things that cannot be seen. We keep our focus on Jesus Christ. In response to our teaching today, and as we wrap up our time together, I want to invite you to stand and let's worship together.